From a young age, I always felt like I was out of place in my small town in western New York. My world seemed restricted, and the future appeared far off and uncertain. My parents did everything they could to support me. My father labored in construction, while my mother managed the household. I was just another average kid, fading into the background both in school and socially. College didn't change much. I went to a local institution and lived at home to save money. My grades were nothing to boast about, and I spent more time working, flipping burgers or assisting my dad on construction sites, than actually hitting the books. When I finally graduated with a degree in business, I foolishly expected doors to open for me. But reality struck hard. The big firms weren't interested, I didn't have an Ivy League pedigree, and my mediocre grades didn't impress. I ended up at a small property management firm, where my role was far from glamorous. Surprisingly, though, this is where I stumbled upon my passion for real estate. My boss noticed my growing enthusiasm and took me under his wing, mentoring me and teaching me the ropes of the industry. This unexpected turn set me on a path I hadn't anticipated. Now, it was time to turn the page and start anew. I parked my SUV in the airport's long-term lot, estimating it would be about 2 weeks before anyone noticed it had been abandoned. With only a briefcase and a small travel case in tow, I walked towards the Delta terminal. Inside the briefcase were all the necessities, several forms of identification, a few $1,000s in cash, and my travel documents. To a casual observer, everything looked ordinary. But anyone who really knew me would detect something off. The IDs bore a different name, even though the face on the license and passport was undeniably mine. Today was the beginning of my new life under a new identity. I entered the terminal and went through security to catch my flight. The TSA was thorough but efficient. They checked my ticket and x-rayed my briefcase, wallet, and car keys. With no bombs, water bottles, or other prohibited items in sight, they concluded I wasn't a threat and let me through. My next stop was the men's room, where I ducked into a stall and changed out of my business attire. Underneath, I had a whole new look, a tourist's outfit complete with a flashy shirt, shorts, and summer shoes. I emerged looking like just another vacationer returning from Las Vegas, blending in seamlessly with the crowd. I followed the throng to baggage claim, where I spotted a small, unremarkable suitcase left alone on the conveyor. Since no one seemed to care about it, I grabbed it and made my way to the exit. I took the inter-terminal transport and, 10 minutes later, arrived at another terminal. I hit the restroom again, discarded another layer of clothing, and tucked it away in the suitcase I'd taken. At the ticket counter, I checked the bag, used one of my new IDs, and got my boarding pass. Instead of re-entering the TSA checkpoint, I wandered through the shopping area, blending into the crowd before slowly making my way to the exit. Soon, I was back on the tram heading to Continental's terminal. This time, I was truly preparing to board a plane and leave the airport. Before long, I was on an international flight, having successfully transformed into someone else. My new life starts now. My cheating, deceitful wife will never find me or my money. I guess it's time to explain what led to this dramatic shift in my life. Let me give you a bit of background about myself. I was born in Western New York in 1960 and graduated high school with average marks. I wasn't exceptional in academics or sports. You could say I was just another average kid. My parents weren't wealthy professionals. My mother stayed home, while my father worked in construction. I went to a local college and lived at home during the school year. I juggled part-time work in fast food with summer jobs in construction alongside my dad. My college grades were pretty mediocre, with a 2.6 GPA over 4 years. I didn't focus much on school, spending long hours working and just doing enough to scrape by. When I graduated with a business degree, I was eager to make a name for myself. But reality hit hard when none of the big companies showed any interest in hiring me. I suppose my average grades from an unremarkable college with a simple business degree didn't stand out among the high-flying graduates. So, I adjusted my expectations and took a job with a small property management firm. There were no private offices or secretaries, just a desk, a phone, and a lot of responsibilities for little pay. My dreams of a cushy white-collar job with regular hours were dashed. In this small business, everyone wore multiple hats. I was responsible for chasing down tenants for overdue rent, assisting with evictions, interviewing prospective renters, and even helping out with maintenance tasks like cleaning and painting. Although the pay wasn't great, I learned the ins and outs of the real estate business by handling every aspect of it. Along the way, I discovered a passion for real estate, not for a beautiful woman, but for the industry itself. My boss, the owner of the firm, noticed my growing enthusiasm and took me under his wing. He had a few adult children, but none of them showed interest in taking over his business. I suppose I became the surrogate child he'd always wanted, someone he could pass his knowledge to. One day, he called me into his office. "Billy, take a look at these bank foreclosures and let me know which ones you think would be good investments for us," he said. I admitted that I'd never done this before. "Don't worry," he replied. "I'll review your recommendations before we make any decisions. I need your results right after lunch." Lunch at his company was at noon, and it was already almost 10 o'clock. He didn't give me much time. I decided to skip lunch and spent the next 3 hours poring over the listings. I found a few that I thought might interest him. At 1 o'clock, I walked into his office and presented my picks. He listened for almost an hour before cutting me off. "Everything you chose is terrible," he said bluntly. "Come over here, and I'll show you how it's done." We spent the rest of the week reviewing the options, and by the end, we had identified a few properties with significant potential. I learned a lot during that week and came to realize that my modest boss was a real estate genius. He bid on 4 of our selections and won one, a 4-family apartment building from the early 1910s. It was located in a neighborhood on the edge of an upscale area, popular with young couples and college students. The building required extensive renovations, but we managed to purchase it at an excellent price. The bank provided us with all the necessary construction loans and even postponed the mortgage payments for 6 months. Essentially, we acquired the building with almost no money down and had ample funds for the renovations. At closing, my boss handed me the keys and said, "This is your project. Start tomorrow." Over the next 6 months, I experienced a roller coaster of emotions. I fluctuated between exhilarating highs and crushing lows, learning more about the rental business than I ever imagined. By the time the first mortgage payment came due, I had managed to rent out all the apartments, and everything was running smoothly. Then, my boss surprised me again. "Bill, sign these papers for the 4-family building we bought," he said. "Sure, but why?" I asked. "Because I'm transferring ownership to you," he replied. "It's your building now." I was taken aback. "Bill, I'm getting old," he said. "I want to pass my knowledge on to someone. I hope you'll let me pass it to you. My kids will probably sell off all my properties as is when I'm gone. So, we'll start you on your own real estate business. Please accept this small gift from me." That's how I got started. I soon established Bilco Properties LLC. My friend and mentor passed away about 5 years later, just as he had predicted. His children sold off everything, aiming for top dollar, and eventually found a buyer willing to pay. By that time, I owned 15 properties, all in desirable locations and fully rented. My financial strategy was based on a 50% occupancy rate, meaning if half of a building was rented, it covered all expenses. Most of my buildings maintained 100% occupancy. I wasn't rich, but I was comfortably secure. I expanded my portfolio to include a few commercial properties. When the man who bought my late boss's business went bankrupt, it was because he had overestimated his abilities. He thought he could hire a lot of help and spend all his time golfing, but he was mistaken. At 30 years old, I met the woman who would become my wife. I had bought a commercial property in a decent neighborhood, and she, along with a friend, rented one of the office suites to start a decorating business. When they met me, I was dressed as I usually was, just like any other worker. They, on the other hand, were dressed to the nines, looking like they had stepped out of a fashion magazine. I guess, as interior decorators, they needed to make a statement. And make a statement they did. Wendy, the more assertive of the two, captured my heart. I envisioned her standing in front of a charming, vine-covered cottage with two small children, waiting for their dad to come home. I imagined myself as that dad. When I quoted them the rent, I could see from their expressions that it was beyond their budget. Given the building's vacancies, I decided to be generous. "There's only one other vacancy," I said. "I can offer you a discounted introductory rate for the first year." "How much lower?" they asked in unison. "About half, if that's acceptable," I replied. The owner allows some flexibility on introductory rates. They quickly accepted the offer and signed a 1-year lease with an option for renewal, with the rent to be determined later. "Can we get the owner's name and address to thank him?" Wendy asked. I provided them with my mother's maiden name, a fake first name, and the company's P.O. box, explaining that the owner preferred not to be bothered and a short note would suffice. For the next year, I continued to help them with all their issues, dressing like any other worker. I watched their small business slowly expand. By the start of their second year, they renewed their lease, though at a higher rate. It was still about 25% less than what other tenants were paying. As I mentioned before, both Wendy and her partner were incredibly attractive. One day, Wendy told me that her partner was getting married and moving to the West Coast with her new husband. "Can I get out of our lease?" Wendy asked. "I don't think I can manage it with my partner leaving. I'm not sure about breaking the lease, but I can reduce the rent back to its original rate. My boss isn't fond of empty office suites." The truth was, I didn't want her to leave. Her face lit up with a bright smile, and she gave me a kiss. That kiss sealed the deal. I was smitten. After we parted, she gave me a different look and a special smile. That was the start of our relationship. A year later, I found myself standing at the altar, exchanging vows. By the time we had been married for a year, our daughter was born. Wendy had a difficult pregnancy and delivery, and her doctor advised against having more children, so she had her tubes tied. Our life remained stable, but Wendy's enthusiasm for it began to wane. Mine, however, did not. Wendy shifted her focus to her business. From then on, she failed to recognize that I was more than just a lackluster worker for a wealthy landlord. She began treating me with disdain, seeing herself as the primary breadwinner. I tried to explain that I owned several properties, but she never gave me the chance. Whenever I started to talk about it, she'd cut me off, saying, "I don't want to hear about your work, it's boring." To keep our family intact, I accepted her low opinion of me. She remained beautiful, while I considered myself just average. By enduring her put-downs, I managed to keep my stunning wife and daughter. My daughter quickly became the center of my world. When I wasn't working on real estate deals, I spent every available moment with her. Watching her grow up was my sole motivation. Wendy and I drifted further apart. She was increasingly absorbed by her wealthy and influential clients, while I continued to acquire properties. Some I held on to, and others I sold quickly for a profit. I was quietly amassing a fortune she was unaware of. Wendy grew more contemptuous and distant. Eventually, I was banished to the spare bedroom. The reasons given were my snoring, tossing and turning, and of course, smelling like a lowly worker. At first, I was allowed to visit her bed weekly, but that dwindled to once a month, if I was lucky. The only reason I tolerated this was my love for my daughter. I knew if I confronted Wendy and we divorced, she'd get custody and I'd be stuck with the bills. I loved my daughter too much to let a selfish wife exclude me from her life. I channeled my frustration and loneliness into my real estate business, running it with a secretive, intense passion. I set up a complex network of interlocking corporations, each with its own P.O. boxes and office fronts. Most of my employees worked from different buildings, while my main office had just me and my loyal bookkeeper. To everyone else, I appeared as just another worker, and I never bothered to correct that impression. By the time my daughter Amy turned 15, my real estate portfolio was valued at about $25 million in mortgage-free properties, with an additional $50 million under some debt. These assets were divided among various corporate entities and addresses. Rents were collected through different P.O. boxes, and some funds were quietly funneled into offshore accounts to dodge taxes. I was steadily building considerable wealth. My holdings now included nearly 100 properties, no longer just small apartment buildings, but also large complexes, strip malls, commercial office spaces, and even a shopping mall. Amy and I grew very close over the years. I was the parent who was always present, cheering at her games, sitting by her bedside when she was ill, and spending hours at the mall with her. I took on the role of the mother in these moments, as Wendy was too absorbed in her own life to be involved. Wendy's business was flourishing, and since I never flaunted my wealth or changed my lifestyle, she continued to see herself as the primary breadwinner. I never corrected her, as I didn't want her to think I had money and then risk a divorce. Wendy viewed me as a failure, someone living off her success, and she no longer bothered to hide her disdain. In our home, I was relegated to a secondary status, needing a promotion just to be seen as a significant figure. While I endured her attitude, I also began to hide more of my wealth offshore. I didn't want to be left financially exposed if Wendy decided to trade up. Wendy's decorating business involved hiring very artistic individuals who made me uncomfortable. Wendy took pleasure in making my life difficult by ensuring these employees were assigned to help me. They often crossed boundaries, and Wendy seemed to enjoy every minute of it. I accepted this treatment to stay in the marriage and remain close to my daughter. I had become a coward. My husband, Bill, was a decent man but lacked ambition. I was always driven, striving to improve our lives, while Bill seemed content to hold me back. He was an average lover and the father of our only child, treating our daughter like a princess. He was always there for her but did nothing for me. I often wondered what I saw in him. He was just average, satisfied with a dead-end job as a gopher for a reclusive real estate mogul. Although he was always pleasant, he was essentially the landlord's errand boy. I could easily get him to bend over backward for us, securing lower rent and plenty of extras. In our second year of business, Millie and I realized we were not suited to be partners. In our business, I played the role of the assertive go-getter. If a client was male, I'd flirt and hint at possible connections to secure their business. If the client was female and intrigued, I'd indulge her curiosity to close the deal. Millie, my partner, had ethics and refused to engage in such tactics. But I thrived on the thrill of it. Eventually, Millie grew weary of my manipulative behavior and left for the West Coast with her boyfriend. She handed over the business and its assets to me, while I offered her nothing in return. Faced with the prospect of covering the rent for our swanky office suite without her help, I turned to Bill. I managed to negotiate another year at a reduced rate and, as a gesture of thanks, I kissed him. The kiss started as a playful thank you but quickly became more. Perhaps it was because I hadn't had a satisfying encounter with my lovers in a while. I was feeling rather needy. Bill, despite his faults, was surprisingly attentive in bed. He always put me first, unlike the men I was used to, who were only interested in their own pleasure, leaving me unsatisfied. I rarely engaged with women outside business unless it was for personal satisfaction, and I made sure they were happy, but it was always a business transaction. However, Bill's dullness outside the bedroom was a different story. He showed no interest in current events, popular culture, or anything that could spark a lively conversation. Our discussions at social gatherings often ended quickly because he could only talk about real estate and bookkeeping, topics that bored my friends to no end. I made several attempts to broaden his horizons by taking him to operas, philharmonic concerts, and plays, but he would often fall asleep, snoring through the events. In my line of work, attending charity events was essential for self-promotion. When Bill accompanied me, he'd sit at the table, contributing nothing to the evening. He didn't dress well and was more of a burden than an asset. Although I should have invested in improving his public image, I was too absorbed in expanding my business. One day, I received an invitation to a high-profile charity event. I didn't inform Bill until it was too late for him to change his plans. "Bill, I'm going to this event whether you come or not. It's crucial for my business, and I'm the one supporting our lifestyle," I said firmly. "But won't it look bad if you go alone?" Bill asked. "I'll bring one of my decorators. He'll be a visible presence and won't be mistaken for a lover," I reassured him. At the event, I found myself alone at the bar, as my date had disappeared with another guest. That's when a striking man approached me. "Excuse me," he said with a charming smile, "I noticed your escort seems to have abandoned you. I'm James William Hawthorne. If you don't mind, I'd love to keep you company tonight." The first thought that struck me when I saw James was, wow, he's stunning. He was impeccably dressed, articulate, and radiated an air of wealth. I accepted his invitation with a thrill that I hadn't felt in a long time. The evening we spent together was exhilarating, and as I rode home in the taxi, I realized my excitement wasn't about Bill, it was about James. A week later, James called me. "Hi Wendy, would you like to join me for lunch? I'm thinking of redecorating my office and would love your opinion," he said. That was the start of it all. Within a month, we were lovers, meeting 2 or 3 afternoons a week at various hotels. James was a different kind of lover. While Bill always prioritized my pleasure, James was more complex. He often treated me as if I were beneath him, a stark contrast to Bill's devotion. But there was a thrill in being with James that I couldn't ignore. He pushed me to explore desires and experiences Bill never would. Sometimes, I would be sore from the intensity of James's demands. I was his submissive, and he was dominant. My feelings for Bill, though deep, started to fade as I yearned for the control James wielded. I even began to embrace James's habit of inviting other men into our bed, finding myself unable to resist the exciting new dynamic. Realizing I needed a place of my own for our clandestine meetings, I set a plan into motion. "Bill, I'm renting an apartment in the city. The commute from the farm is taking up too much of my time, almost an hour each way. I could be more productive if I didn't have to spend so much time traveling," I said. "I know you love this farm, so you and Amy can stay here. There's no need to disrupt your lives." Bill's protest was weak. "But Wendy," I cut him off. "This isn't up for discussion. I've already made up my mind. I've narrowed it down to 2 options and I'll be moved in by the end of the month." Seeing the hurt in his eyes, I added, "Don't worry, I'll still be home on weekends for you and Amy." James helped me choose a luxurious apartment just minutes from my office. To make Bill feel involved, I took him to see the place. "I knew you'd love it," I said, trying to make it seem like a collaborative decision. "I'll use it to showcase my decorating skills." As we left the building, I noticed the manager seemed to know Bill. I assumed they had met at one of the real estate events Bill frequented. The day Wendy moved into her new apartment, ostensibly to avoid the long drive from our country house, I knew for certain that our marriage was over. I had suspected she was seeing someone else, but this confirmed it. Wendy had no idea that I owned that apartment building, one of my more upscale properties. The manager, who had recognized me, wanted to speak, but I pretended we were just acquaintances, not employer and employee. Later, the manager shared with me what he knew about Wendy and her affair. My heart shattered. Despite everything, I still loved Wendy, and the betrayal was nearly unbearable. My only course of action was to gather enough evidence to ensure I could secure custody of our child. The manager revealed that Wendy and her lover had selected the apartment together, and even filled out the application jointly. They had turned it into their private love nest. Determined to protect my interests, I decided to wire the apartment for video and audio surveillance before Wendy moved in. With ample funds at my disposal, I arranged for the installation, disguising it as part of a new building security system. This allowed me to collect evidence discreetly. I made sure Wendy paid the full rent, which was slightly higher than the other units, but since her boyfriend was covering the costs, it didn't matter to me. I ensured that the lease was in our name to make the evidence I gathered admissible in court. As Wendy effectively moved out, my visits to her bedroom ceased. Despite her promises to return on weekends, she rarely did. When she did visit Amy and me, Amy was overjoyed to have her mother around. At her age, she craved that maternal connection, and I played along, believing it was just a phase. Little did I know how wrong I was. When Wendy did grace my bed with her presence, I found myself unable to perform. The images of her with her lover, the sounds of their intimate moments, and his derogatory comments about me haunted me. I could hear her agreeing with him that I was inadequate both as a lover and as a man. "Bill, what's wrong with you?" Wendy asked after one failed attempt. "We haven't been intimate in months, and you can't even get excited? If I didn't know better, I'd think you had a girlfriend." "I'm sorry, Wendy, but I've got too much on my mind to perform," I replied. "I'll do better next time, I promise." But there was no next time. Wendy's boyfriend sent the rent checks for the apartment to a P.O. box, which eventually made their way to me. I copied them and deposited the originals into the bank. Some might wonder why I didn't seek revenge while he was with my wife. Don't worry, I did. The bank manager handling my company's accounts was a close friend, and he was also acquainted with the manager at Wendy's lover's bank. For amusement, we began monitoring his finances. We discovered he was living on the edge, relying on the float time between deposits and withdrawals. His accounts were often short on cash. If his rent check for Wendy's apartment was deposited at certain times of the month, it would either bounce or cause his other checks to bounce. We started playing with his accounts. Soon, he was hit with return check fees and late rent charges from my company, as well as bank fees on his wife's bounced checks. His wife's embarrassment grew as her checks were refused at her favorite stores, and even her friends started asking for cash when splitting lunch bills. Our plan was working flawlessly. His credit rating plummeted due to all the bounced checks and fees. His credit card companies didn't close his accounts but lowered his credit limit to exactly what he owed, preventing him from charging anything more. This also affected his wife's use of the joint cards, and as you can imagine, she was furious. No woman likes her credit card being declined. I reveled in every moment of it. Not only was he losing money to fees, but he also had to explain to his wife why their finances were in such disarray. I'm sure their household finances led to some very tense and revealing conversations. Then fate handed me another break. Wendy's health took a turn for the worse. She went to see her doctor for what she described as female health issues, and the Pap smear revealed a form of cancer. Our relationship had deteriorated so much that she didn't share the full extent of her condition with me, only mentioning that she needed surgery for some female problems. The full truth came out when our 17-year-old daughter, Amy, accidentally revealed the situation. She told me she planned to stay with her mother during her treatment. "Amy, why?" I asked, feeling the sting of her decision. "Dad, it's not that you've been a bad father," she reassured me. "But Mom needs me. She has ovarian cancer. Even though I don't love her like I used to, I still want to help her through this. I want to be there for her. I missed my daughter terribly, but I had to stay focused on my plans. If Amy chose to be with her mother instead of me, I had to accept it. It pained me, but I figured that living with her mom might eventually show Amy who her mother truly was. The following Sunday, I went to church. It had been years since I'd set foot in one, but I felt a profound need to thank God. Not for Wendy's recovery, but for the cancer that had made my life so much easier. It was the best thing that could have happened to me. Wendy was suffering, and her lover was the one paying the price, enduring the fallout without any reward. He had to deal with her vomiting, watch her hair fall out, and see her waste away into a shadow of her former self. In one of the surveillance tapes, I saw how he neglected her, leaving her in filth until he felt like helping. Amy, however, was there for her mother. It was clear she took on the burden of care, a role I had hoped would reveal Wendy's true nature to her. I made an appointment with my attorney and instructed him to prepare for a divorce, aiming to minimize my financial loss to just his fees. I also wanted him to make sure Wendy's lover's wife had all the information she needed to destroy him. My lawyer gave me the usual spiel about no-fault divorce and splitting everything 50-50, but I had other plans. I handed over all the video and audio evidence, copies of the rent checks paid by Wendy's lover for her apartment, and the rental application signed by him and Wendy. I instructed him to prepare everything but wait for my signal to serve it. My next step was to sell all my properties. I had to do it gradually to avoid lowering their value too much. Luckily, the real estate market was booming, and new firms were competing in the area. They ended up in bidding wars over my prime properties, often paying more than I expected. Meanwhile, I slowly cleared out our house, selling it with the closing scheduled for the day after Wendy was served. About 6 months later, I gave my lawyer the green light to deliver all the evidence to Wendy's lover's wife. Once she kicked him out, he moved in with Wendy and Amy, thinking they had a fresh start as a happy family. But soon, they realized they were financially ruined. His wife had frozen all his assets, and I had siphoned Wendy's accounts into my offshore holdings. They were left with nothing. One day, my building manager, Phil, who managed Wendy's apartment, left me a message that simply said, "Check the video I'm sending you today. Your daughter is in trouble." I hadn't reviewed the surveillance footage in months, as my lawyer had assured me we had ample evidence for the divorce. But Phil's message worried me. That afternoon, a messenger delivered a CD containing the footage. It was organized chronologically, starting about 4 months earlier. As I watched, my heart sank. The footage revealed Wendy's lover abusing and tormenting my daughter. Amy cried for hours, repeatedly asking, "Why did you let this happen, Mommy?" The footage showed not just the initial abuse but continued mistreatment. I saw Amy's desperate pleas for mercy and her attempts to avoid further harm. It was heartbreaking to witness her spiral into dependence, begging for her next fix. Wendy, listening from her bedroom, did nothing to intervene. Her eyes filled with tears, but she remained passive, unable to stand up to her lover's control. As time passed, Amy became a willing participant in exchange for the pills she was addicted to. The recording spanned 4 months, and by the time I saw them, it was too late to rescue my daughter from her nightmare. At 4 a.m., after hours of anguished viewing, I called my attorney, leaving a message imploring him to help Amy, to get her out of that apartment before something even worse happened. I knew she was 18 now, and legally my options were limited, but I couldn't ignore what was happening to her. The next day, my lawyer returned my call. He said he would look into helping Amy but warned me that, as an adult, there wasn't much he could do. Later that day, he called back with even more distressing news. Amy was pregnant, and Wendy's lover was alleged to be the father. He was exploiting her, forcing her into prostitution, and keeping her addicted to pills to maintain control. The situation worsened and my lawyer revealed that one night, while Wendy's lover and Amy were working a hotel, the client turned out to be an undercover cop. Wendy's lover was arrested on charges including contributing to the delinquency of a minor, along with various prostitution and drug-related offenses. I doubted he'd escaped these charges, but I decided to take further action. I sent the tapes from Wendy's apartment to the police and local news media. The public exposure ensured that he'd never work in town again and gave his wife additional leverage in their divorce proceedings. While Wendy's lover remained in jail awaiting trial, unable to make bail, my daughter was also incarcerated, with no money for her release. Alan, my lawyer, and I discussed Amy's situation. He advised that keeping her in jail might be the best option, allowing her to enter a treatment program. If I bailed her out, she might end up back on the streets, dependent once more. It was better to let her stay where she could get help and where he could monitor her progress. Later that day, I used the footage to digitally alter the faces of the men involved. 3 weeks later, their lives ended in an alley behind their favorite bar. Fortunately for Wendy's lover, he was still in jail, or he would have joined them. One of my storefront tenants had connections to organized crime and owed me a favor, which proved to be fortuitous in this grim turn of events. In the meantime, Wendy's business fell apart. While she was undergoing treatment, a couple of her employees, with my covert assistance, started their own decorating firm and managed to poach most of Wendy's clients. As a result, her business crumbled. I, as her landlord, evicted her from her office suite. With no income and no health insurance, Wendy was left destitute. She reached out to me, requesting to be added to my health insurance policy. I complied, but I had anticipated this move. Her pre-existing condition wouldn't be covered. That brings me to the present. I was on a plane to South America, ensuring I was untraceable. Upon landing in Cannes, would switch identities once more and head to Europe. From there, I'd make another switch and relocate to a warmer location. My aim was to remain hidden from both Wendy and any local authorities who might link me to the recent events. Before leaving for Australia, I spoke with my lawyer, Alan. He informed me that Amy had been trying to contact me, hoping for reconciliation. She had somehow learned about my wealth. Alan told her I was unreachable unless I chose to be found. I instructed him to use my resources to prepare a defense for Amy but to keep her in jail for as long as possible. She was making progress in overcoming her addiction, and I worried that her release might trigger a relapse. Crystal meth was notoriously difficult to quit, often requiring multiple attempts before successful recovery, if the user was truly committed. 6 months later, I called Alan to check on the status of my divorce. He told me there was no need for a divorce. Wendy had passed away before it was finalized. Since we weren't divorced, and Wendy had no money, I was responsible for her medical bills. She died alone in a charity ward, with no visitors, enduring her final days in pain. I covered her medical expenses, feeling a twinge of guilt despite everything. Wendy had once been the love of my life, even though her actions and greed had driven us apart. A small part of me still cared for her. I was abroad, and Amy was still in jail when Wendy died. There was no funeral. Alan informed me that her ashes were at the county coroner's office, awaiting someone to claim them. If no one did, they would be buried in an unmarked grave with other indigent persons. Alan likely expected me to handle Wendy's remains, but I had no intention of doing so. The pain and humiliation she had caused me were too fresh. Instead, I asked about Amy. She had lost the baby in the 4th month due to an STD. She was serving a 12-month sentence for prostitution and drug possession but was in a reputable treatment program and seemed to be making progress. What about Wendy's lover? I asked, though I already knew the answer. He had died in a prison fight. His kind wasn't welcomed by other inmates. Well, Alan said, if Amy asks for help with her mother's arrangements, provide her with the funds she needs, but only if she's clean and drug-free. Support her financially until she completes her education and can stand on her own. If she isn't clean, give her just enough to end her suffering, and then bury them both in unmarked graves. I knew it sounded harsh, but I'd rather see my daughter dead than living as a dependent on the streets. If Amy overdosed, at least she'd be spared prolonged suffering. If she ended up on the streets, she'd eventually fall victim to some ruthless pimp. I didn't want her to endure needless pain if she couldn't overcome her addiction. But if she somehow beat the odds, recovered, and stayed clean, I'd ensure she had the resources for a fresh start. With millions at my disposal, a little money for my daughter seemed a small price to pay. Maybe, just maybe, she would defy the odds. 4 years later, I visited my old attorney, Alan. We hadn't spoken in years, and he was retiring and closing his practice. I wanted to wish him well in retirement and give him a monetary gift. Alan had been a good friend, my only friend, really. As a lonely old man, he was the only one who seemed to care about me. Driving my new Bentley through town, I was flooded with memories, both good and bad. I took extra time to drive past the properties I once owned. Most of the area where I had invested in apartments had thrived, and my former commercial properties had increased in value. It was a shame that divorcing Wendy had forced me to sell them and hide my wealth. I sometimes wondered if Wendy would have respected me more if she had known about all my assets, but it was too late to find out. I parked in front of Alan's office, one of the few buildings I still owned. I had kept it primarily because it housed Alan's practice. I wanted to ensure he had security, so now that he was retiring, I planned to deed the building to him as a gift. "Ah, you old scum sucker," Alan greeted me with a grin. "Takes one to know one," I replied. We hugged and shook hands, and it felt as though no time had passed. We caught up on everything that had happened over the years. When the conversation slowed, Alan asked, "Aren't you going to ask about your daughter, Amy?" "Not really," I said, though I suspected he'd tell me anyway. "Well, Bill," Alan began, "you'd be proud of her. After she got out of jail, she enrolled in a rehab program for pills and completed it. She stayed on as a counselor and successfully kicked her addiction." I offered a sarcastic, "Whoopee," though a part of me was glad to hear she'd made it. Alan continued, "Amy also enrolled in a social work program at the local college. She excelled, finishing the 4-year course in just 3 years. She graduates next month, and you paid for it all." I was surprised to hear this. Alan added, "I took some liberties with your instructions. You might also want to meet your son-in-law, Frank Murphy, and your granddaughter, Vivian. The baby is nearly 7 months old and already showing a strong personality. She's going to be a heartbreaker, just like her grandmother." "You also covered their expenses beyond what Frank's modest income could handle," Alan said. "This included a nanny named Chloe, who lives across the hall from them and pretends to be just a helpful neighbor. She gives Amy time to study and Frank room to grow in his career." I agreed to stay in town for Amy's graduation and attend the events surrounding it. Alan managed to get us into not just the ceremony, but also the pre- and post-graduation gatherings. At one of the pre-graduation events, I caught sight of my daughter and her husband. It had been years since I'd seen Amy, and I was struck by how much she resembled her mother. Her beauty was undeniable, a mirror image of the woman I once loved. Seeing her in person, after all the time and distance, was unexpectedly overwhelming. I hadn't anticipated how emotionally challenging this graduation would be. I turned to Alan and said, "I don't want to get involved in Amy's life anymore. Please don't expect me to greet them or make a fuss. It's too painful. Promise me you'll honor that." "I promise," Alan said, his voice sincere. The next day, Alan and I sat halfway up in the stands as the graduates were announced. The ceremony was a spectacle of celebration, with families cheering and applauding as each student walked across the stage. When Amy's name was called, her husband stood nearby, holding their baby. From where I sat, I could see the tears streaming down his face. The applause for Amy was louder and more enthusiastic than for anyone else, and a wave of pride surged through me. As Amy stepped to the center of the stage, the dean's voice rang out over the crowd. "It is with great pleasure that I present this special award to Amy Murphy. You have been selected by your fellow students and the faculty for this honor. Mrs. Murphy, you are recognized for your unwavering support of others. Because of your efforts, the dropout rate among your peers has plummeted. Along with your diploma, you will receive a certificate of appreciation signed by all your classmates and faculty. Amy, we all hold you in high regard. As Amy accepted her award, the crowd erupted into a standing ovation. In that moment, I felt an overwhelming sense of pride. My daughter had achieved so much, and despite everything, I was genuinely happy for her. After the ceremony, I made my way towards the parking lot. The aisles were packed, and as I moved with the crowd, I tried to stay inconspicuous, hoping not to draw attention. But then, as if by some cruel twist of fate, I saw Amy, her husband, and my granddaughter walking up the aisle close by. I thought, I need to find a place to hide, but there was no escaping this situation. I was cornered. While my daughter and her husband seemed oblivious to my presence, my granddaughter spotted me. At nearly 9 months old, she had a keen awareness and began to call out "bua," the term many children use for their grandfathers. She reached out her tiny arms and kicked her feet, trying to break free from her father's hold. Amy glanced over, her eyes following her daughter's gaze. Unbeknownst to me, Chloe had been showing pictures of me to my granddaughter and explaining who I was. The little one had clearly absorbed this information. Amy took a deep breath, composed herself, and approached me. "Hi, Dad. Thanks for coming and supporting us all these years," she said calmly. Later, I discovered that Alan had been discreetly monitoring Amy and her family over the years. He had also informed her that it was my money supporting her education and living expenses. Despite the tumultuous past, Amy had managed to turn her life around, and her gratitude was evident in that brief, heartfelt exchange. Alan had been filling the fatherly role I couldn't, all while keeping me informed and involved. As I looked at Amy, I smiled and said, "I wouldn't have missed your graduation for anything. Paying for your education was the least I could do, considering I left you to handle things on your own." Amy's husband, Frank, was visibly surprised. He fumbled for words, clearly unsure how to navigate the unexpected situation. I reached out and steadied him by the arm, trying to offer some reassurance. Meanwhile, my granddaughter, Vivian, tugged at my shirt and started calling out "bopa," the term she'd learned for grandfather. Amy looked at me with a soft, hopeful expression. "Vivian wants you to hold her, Dad. Would you like to?" Before I could respond, I found myself cradling the enthusiastic little girl. Vivian wrapped her tiny arms around my neck and, with a proud tone, announced to anyone within earshot that I was her bopa. In that moment, I was utterly smitten. This little girl had captured my heart completely. It was as if I had instantly stepped into the roles of grandfather, father, and father-in-law all at once, and I cherished every second of it. The years of loneliness seemed to dissipate, and I felt my heart begin to heal. As we made our way through the bustling parking lot, Alan suggested, "Bill, let's get to your car and head to a restaurant. You have a lot to catch up on with your family." When Frank saw the Bentley, a $300,000 luxury vehicle, he stopped in his tracks, eyes wide with amazement. I handed him the keys with a smile and said, "Want to drive, son?" The grin that spread across his face was brighter than the parking lot lights, and his excitement was palpable. We drove over to Frank's old Ford to grab the car seat and other essentials for traveling with a small child. As I looked at the aging vehicle, a thought occurred to me. Tomorrow, I'd give Frank his own set of keys to the Bentley. I'd get myself a new car later. As we set off, I found myself sitting in the back seat next to Vivian, who was nestled comfortably between Amy and me. The little girl held onto my arm, chattering away with the boundless energy typical of her age. A lump formed in my throat as I took in the scene. "Dad," Amy began, her voice tinged with emotion, "we have a lot to talk about. I need to apologize. I was a selfish kid, and I didn't realize how much it hurt you when I left to live with Mom." "You don't need to apologize," I replied, my voice steady despite the emotion welling up inside me. I'm proud of how you've turned your life around and built such a wonderful family. I understand now that you needed your mother back then just as much as she needed you. I only wish you hadn't been taken advantage of by that James creep. Amy nodded, her eyes filled with regret. I hope I never see James again. He ruined Mom with his lies and dragged me into pills. If Frank hadn't found me, I'd still be in jail or worse, dead from an overdose. It took me 4 tries to finally kick the dependence. Frank's love and support helped me overcome that final hurdle. Now, little Vivian is my reason for staying clean. There's so much I want to share with her as her mother. The conversation was heavy, but also healing. We had a lot to discuss, and I was eager to hear about her journey and the life she was building. The prospect of being involved in her life again, of being a part of her new beginning, was both daunting and exhilarating. For the first time in years, I felt a glimmer of hope for the future, knowing that we could rebuild and move forward together. During our ride, Amy cried almost continuously. Her tears weren't from sadness, but from a profound sense of family she had longed for and finally felt complete. We talked through dinner, at their apartment the next day, and in the days that followed at my hotel. For the next month, we slowly worked through years of pain and loneliness, slowly rebuilding our fractured relationship. Eventually, we both came to a realization: Wendy had been the root of many of our problems. Wendy had been a beautiful woman on the outside but deeply flawed and selfish on the inside. Despite her many shortcomings, I still missed her. No one could ever replace her in my heart. Amy came to understand that I wasn't the villain her mother had made me out to be, but rather a man far greater than Wendy ever acknowledged. At some point during our conversations, Amy looked at me with a thoughtful expression. "You still love her, don't you, Dad?" "It still hurts when I think about how much contempt she had for me," I admitted. "But yes, I suppose a part of me still loves her. I wasn't a coward, I loved her with all my heart. But she hurt me deeply, and I had to protect myself from being completely destroyed." About 2 months into our reconciliation, Alan dropped a bombshell during dinner. "What do you want me to do with Wendy's ashes?" "They've been sitting on a shelf in my office for quite some time." The table fell silent as the weight of his question sank in. My granddaughter, Vivian, broke the silence. "Want Nana?" Amy and I exchanged a glance. "Dad," Amy began, her voice trembling, "I thought I'd never get to say goodbye since I was in jail when she died. But now that I've heard your story, I have things to say to Mom, some not very nice things. Can we get her?" "Okay," I replied. "I have things to say too, but I'm not apologizing. After all the pain she caused, she deserved what happened to her. But I'm not blaming you, Amy. I lived with her and the man who dragged me into that darkness. They deserved what you did, and so did I. I was awful to you until I hit rock bottom in jail and started turning my life around." Frank chimed in, "Dad, I met Amy at a halfway house where she was a counselor. I was in rehab for alcohol, and she helped me get sober. We've been together since. We all agreed that Vivian should have some connection to her grandmother, even if it was just a gravesite. It would also give Amy and me a place to process our lingering anger. We picked up the urn from Alan's office and placed it in the trunk of my Bentley. I hoped the ride would be uncomfortable for her, as she used to get car sick. We relocated to a small farm outside the city in Virginia, where Frank and I decided to raise horses and offer stabling services. Wendy's ashes were eventually laid to rest in a family plot on the farm, alongside remains from the 1800s. We cleaned up the area and added a picket fence, leaving space for more graves. I had a headstone made for Wendy that read, "Wendy Adams, 1956 to 1995. Cancer sufferer. She will be missed by all who loved her. We all forgive you." As the years passed, I noticed that Vivian often played near the grave. One day, I asked her why. Grandma talks to me and helps me read, she said. She told me she's sorry for hurting you and hopes you'll forgive her. She also asked if she can wait here until it's your turn, so you can walk into the light together. A voice in my head whispered, "Nice try, William, but I don't get car sick anymore." I dropped to my knees and hugged Vivian tightly. "Papa, why are you crying?" she asked, her small voice full of concern.